And now a little bit about us. AIX Education is a student-run initiative to bring together students, educators, researchers, and founders to collectively explore the future of AI in education. We host events like this webinar, as well as conference, and we also publish a bi-weekly newsletter to share the latest discussions and research in this very exciting field.
Yes, today's webinar will focus on equitable strategy for AI integration in education, highlighting approaches in AI literacy, professional development for educators, and collaborative work with students to establish shared norms. I'm excited to introduce today's speakers, Glenn Kleiman, Chris Ma, and Ben Klieger. Glenn is a senior advisor to the Stanford Accelerator for Learning and formerly served as a professor of education and the executive director at the Friday Institute for Educational Innovation at North Carolina State University. Chris is a PhD student at Stanford's Graduate School of Education and is involved in designing professional learning for AI literacy. He is also a member of the Stanford Initiative CRAFT, classroom-ready resources about AI for teaching. Ben Klieger is a first-year student in Stanford's computer science program and the founder of Clara AI, an interactive writing coach that leverages Socratic dialogue and metacognitive questioning. Without further ado, let's welcome our panel. For each of you, can you please introduce yourself and share what inspired you to get into the field of AI in education and what your journey has been like so far? Glenn, we'd love to start with you.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And I'd also like to note that Ben and Chris and I have been working together for several years, which does mean Ben was working with us when he was in high school. So you'll see that we know what each other might be thinking. By introduction, what got me into it? I'm the old guy in the group. I began working in education technology when the Apple II was the cool new machine. I've got lots of experience. I ran an ed tech startup. I was at a nonprofit EDC in the Boston area for many years. And I've worked across everything from software development to state policy and federal policy development. So if nothing else, I bring the history and a wide range of perspectives to bring to the discussion. Chris.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Ma. I'm currently a PhD candidate here at Stanford. My career arc only makes sense kind of in retrospect. I started my career at Google in the online sales and ad sales world, helping businesses grow their e-commerce business. And then I did a total 180. I went into teaching. I taught high school English in Minneapolis for a bunch of years. I was a high school English teacher. And then here at Stanford, I came in with an interest in writing and writing development. So when I got onto a project with Glenn around AI and writing a few months before ChatGPT was released, it was a good opportunity to bring together kind of my background in tech and in teaching. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
And I'll go next. I'm Ben Klieger, and thank you for the introduction. As you said, I'm a CS undergraduate at Stanford, a software engineer, and also the founder of Clara. What inspired me to get into education, I think part of that was when you're a student and then you also love building, naturally you just start building education products. But I think what's had me maintain my interest is that for me in my own personal journey, learning has been so pivotal as a source of empowerment and ability for me to do things that I never dreamed of being able to do. And so I think that working in that field and helping extend that to other people and as many people as possible has been really fulfilling for me. So that's been my journey so far.
Great, thank you for that. I want to go back to you, Ben. Can you talk a little bit more about the development of Clara AI, and from a product perspective, how did you really approach the ideas of equity and fairness when building this out?
Yeah, happy to do that. To give background, this is I think 2 years ago. I can't keep dates straight with AI because I think everything moves so fast, which I think is something relatable for a lot of people. Clara was started when Glenn and I were looking at the landscape of what AI tools for writing looked like. And one of the things that we found was that the only tools at that time, and this is after ChatGPT, but not as recent as now, was tools for students basically to upload their essay, and then they just get a numeric score back. And I think the main reflection that we had was that teachers, and then this is where Chris's insights were really helpful too, teachers already are able to score essays, and we don't need AI to kind of replace what they're doing. Rather, what we need AI to do is to be able to help teachers in the things that they may not have the capacity to do. So one of those things that I've experienced as a student, and I think is a very relatable experience, is when you have an essay, you submit your rough draft, and a week later, the final draft is due. And then by the time you submit the final draft, you get feedback on the rough draft. And you're like, well, this is great, but I can't do anything about this. The issue is that teachers have a lot of students, and it's difficult for teachers to give the kind of individualized one-on-one feedback that would really benefit students up until the point where they submit that writing. And so we were looking at, can we build an AI system that will be able to provide that kind of feedback? One of the important things about this was the design. We didn't want it to be like ChatGPT, where you submit your essay and then all of a sudden it just starts rewriting for you. That's not helpful for students, and teachers don't want that. Instead, what we did was we focused on building Clara to ask the right questions, to prompt the student, and to sometimes give advice. And we did that by looking at the pedagogical techniques and looking at how expert teachers actually worked in the classroom. And we did pilots at a variety of places. And that speaks to, I think, the equity and fairness piece. One of the things that we felt was important was making sure that we actually tested Clara with different environments. So that included private schools, but that also included public schools. It included independent study students, and independent study usually has both people who are seeking extra help and also people who are extending beyond what's in their classroom and want to do more. And so that was part of the approach with Clara. And the second thing is that there are a lot of biases, certainly with AI, and I think that's gotten better, but it's not perfect. And so one of the things that was really important in Clara's design and really pivotal is the idea that Clara puts the agency back in the student's hand. And part of that is because the students are prompted to ask Clara questions. So Clara is integrated into Google Docs, just like you would integrate or interact with a peer editor. So you actually invite Clara, just Clara at uphold.ai, you invite Clara just like you would a student peer. And you're prompted then you have to actually ask Clara questions about your writing. And that engagement is also, instead of what you might find from ChatGPT, which may start writing or give a ton of feedback, the problem with that is it's standardized. It doesn't adapt to the student and doesn't teach the student to ask questions. And yeah, it is Clara with a C, and I'll put a link into the chat as well. And so the goal of Clara was to put that back in the student, where let's help develop students' authentic voice by basically prompting them to develop their own thinking without actually telling them what that thinking should be. So we don't, so we keep the authenticity and the diversity of voices without replacing that, which we might see from other AI products that haven't thought about the pedagogy as much.
Chris, coming from a teacher and classroom background, could you also speak about your work with Ben and Glenn on this project?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to just underscore a point that Ben sort of introduced, which is that Clara is actually very different pedagogically from a lot of the AI writing assists that you see even now. I'm actually working on a research paper right now comparing expert teacher feedback to LLM feedback. And one of the things that we've found is that LLM feedback tends to be very sort of sentence level corrections based, has a very sort of transactional cognitive view of writing feedback, whereas expert teachers are much more likely to ask open-ended questions and position the student as like as an agentic author in and of themselves. So I think in terms of the equitable design of the tools, part of equity is just really sound pedagogy. And so Ben and Glenn and I worked really hard to make sure that the types of feedback Clara was giving were beyond just sort of correcting the student and having sort of a remedial review, but having a much more expansive view of writing and writers.
Awesome, thank you for that. I want to shift the conversation a little bit towards AI literacy, which I know that Chris and Glenn have done a lot of work on. Glenn, I just want to know from a strategic point, what can we do to develop AI literacy programs that are accessible, equitable, and inclusive to all communities?
Great question. Before we go there, I mean, Ben, you didn't say the current status of Clara and where it's available. Maybe you want to take a minute to do that before we move on.
I think so. I think that'd be helpful. Clara was acquired by a writing nonprofit, and there'll be more news soon to come from that. But right now, they're working on hosting that on their writing platform, which will be more scalable than the pilots we did previously. And so more to come. But if you're interested, feel free to reach out. Maybe through the organizers, you can reach out to me, and I can forward those requests. And so you can learn more once it's available, which will hopefully be very soon.
Okay, thanks. So going back to AI literacy. Of course, we've had a lot of movement towards computer literacy, integrating literacy across the curriculum, computer science courses for students, and there's been lots of good progress. And we're really following the pattern with AI, but I guess with a couple of differences. The primary one, or one primary one, is that generative AI applies across all curriculum areas. Of course, ChatGPT can provide feedback, can answer student questions, can help teachers design lesson plans. So there are many different ways it can work, which is a bit overwhelming. And the way I actually see that is we need to think about it as we now have another player in our classroom interactions. We always focused on the interactions of teachers and students. Then we have teacher aides and various specialists coming in. We also have curriculum materials and assessments and video materials. And now there's this entity called AI, which can play certain roles well and other roles not so well. And the big questions are what's its appropriate place in the classroom? And of course, there's not one answer. It depends, well, where are the students? What are they learning now? What are the learning objectives? Can AI be used to help break through barriers to learning, or might it be used in detrimental ways, which really take the responsibility away from the students? And behind all that, I think it's critically important that students and teachers engages in the issues and really understand AI literacy in the sense of understanding what AI is and what it is not. It is not human. It may mimic humans at times, but it's a different kind of intelligence in the classroom. And to really be able to dig in, I think some of the best things I've seen in schools is where teachers and students engaged in understanding AI and then discussing how can it help and support learning? How can it be used in negative ways that really are detrimental to learning? There's lots of good work there. I'm an advisor to Teach AI that is providing some frameworks for using AI in the classroom. It's also, there's now an AI literacy committee that is working with a large group of people actually around the world on putting together some more guidance on AI. But there's lots of things coming up on AI literacy. And I see a lot of it in the classroom. Certainly code.org that does the Hour of Code is now including AI in lots of their activities. ISTE is producing materials. Khan Academy, of course, has materials. So I think there are beginning to be lots of good places for teachers to go to find very useful AI literacy materials.
Thank you for that, Glenn. Chris, you co-authored a paper about creating constructive norms with students collaboratively. And I was wondering, how can educators really create this framework for responsible AI use that is developed collaboratively with students?
Yeah, would it be okay if I tacked onto Glenn's response about AI literacy first?
Yes, of course, yeah.
So I think it's really important also to define what AI literacy is. We like to use the framework by Digital Promise, which is AI literacy as the ability to use, evaluate, and understand AI. And I think just for context, AI literacy used to have this very narrow definition that was mostly computer science oriented. And now, because AI is mainstream, there's much more need for an interdisciplinary approach and an interdisciplinary way of thinking about AI literacy. Very few people need to be sort of technical experts, but everybody needs to have some basic literacy. So related to the study that you mentioned, my big take on AI literacy is we really need to be moving away from a punitive policing, what one teacher I calls the abstinence only model of AI, and more towards promoting everybody understanding how to understand, use, and evaluate AI. You don't have to be an AI fan. You don't have to like AI in order to promote AI literacy. And I think separating those two things is really important. With respect to equity, I'll give you a quick anecdote. I do a lot of professional learning with schools and districts around the area to train staff on what they need to know about AI. And last spring, I was facilitating some AI literacy workshops up in a pretty under-resourced district in the East Bay. And I had to do it from a coffee shop because their district had banned ChatGPT from their network. A couple of weeks later, I was down in the peninsula with a much more better resourced schools, and their school leaders and staff were much more concerned about, how do our staff maximize this for teaching and learning? How do our students, what are the skills our students need to know in the next 15, 20 years? And that type of divide is really what we want to move away from, where we have some schools focusing on bans and punishment and other schools focused on maximizing the technology. So this actually was one of the impetus for the study that you mentioned. So my team here conducted a study where we wanted to explore how teachers and students thought about cheating and learning with AI, specifically about writing. Basically, what we did was we showed them a range of different use cases that a student could use ChatGPT to help them write. So things like help me write an outline, proofread my paragraph, give me some suggestions for a first sentence, that type of thing. And we asked them to discuss the examples and then rank them in order of how much they thought each student learned and how much they thought each student cheated. The sort of punchline is there was a lot of disagreement, and I think that the amount of disagreement really highlighted the complexity of what it actually means to learn and how much context matters. It's a big difference if a student asks for an outline and then just copies and pastes responses from ChatGPT versus if they're thinking about it critically, taking the pieces they like, revising the pieces that they don't. That type of productive struggle is very difficult to regulate in terms of rules and policy, and that's part of what makes norms around AI use so tricky. In terms of co-constructing norms, the teachers that I work with, I often do this activity with them, and I encourage them to do a similar activity with their students, just to open up dialogue about what it actually means to learn and be productive with technologies. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but product design and pedagogical design really, really matter. Context really matters. And unfortunately, there's no sort of easy, black and white policies that a teacher can put into place. It's more about modeling not just what you shouldn't do, but modeling what you can do and should do, and designing learning experiences that show students and model for them how to use the technology productively.
Thank you so much, Chris. I I really love how you pointed out the nuance of navigating the landscape of what is the norm of using AI to learn. And I do wonder, this is a question for all three of you. I do wonder when you were designing Clara or just using AI in your classrooms or maybe in your own self-guided studying, how do you envision what success looks like when you were designing Clara or beyond Clara? What does success look like with learning with AI, if there's any?
Yeah, maybe this is something I think all of us might have slightly different perspectives in a very positive way because we have different backgrounds and experiences. I think being a student myself, I had ideas, but I think the most important thing that I did with Clara in retrospect was recognizing that I needed to get perspectives and co-design directly with teachers and students and people who had interface in the education environment to be able to better understand what success looked like. I think the complexity is that it's not always simple or easy to measure and define success. Or at least that was my initial impression. And I'll give you an example. So there's a teacher who we talk with, a writing instructor, and one of the things that she does is she offers office hours and she supports students through his office hours, basically asking them questions and actually some of the Socratic questions were the inspiration for some of Clara's behavior. But one thing I didn't expect was that she's not looking for, and she actually would rather it not be the case that students always come to her office hours in the sense that you wouldn't want one student to, for every paper, go to office hours. And the reason she says is because she wants them to also develop their own confidence in their own writing. And so that was really interesting, where maybe there's a student that's going to office hours every time or getting help from AI every time, and the writing is improving, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're succeeding in all the ways that matter. One of those being student confidence and their ability to do it without the tool or without those office hours and the resources. And so that really prompted me to think about things temporally and over time. So the idea that maybe Clara should help initially, and the way that Clara helps, that involvement might change over time so that we can encourage student confidence in their writing. And so that's a really good example, I think, where it's not linear. You have to really think about what success means, and it won't be clear in many cases. It's not just there's a better writing. It's not just there's better writing that scores higher marks. And I think it needs to be human focused. So it is about creating a better writer, but that itself is a very multidimensional question.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Ben just said and what Chris just said, but I'd like to also kind of take it to a little broader level of the education system. Because what I worry about with all this, there are major challenges, we could even call them crises in education. We know we have a shortage of teachers. We have issues around teacher retention. We know we have issues about student engagement that have certainly increased. If we look at absentee data and other data, we certainly have pervasive equity issues, both in opportunity and achievement between different groups of students. We have student mental health issues. And so often it seems like, and this is natural given how new this all is and how quickly it's changing, for all of us in education to say, oh, AI is here, it's clearly important, and we have to introduce students to it and prepare them for it. And I think that's where we get AI literacy, and I think that is very important. But I also think as educators, we need to go back to these big issues. Because if we take the equity issue, for example, and I know that's a theme of this webinar, um, perhaps AI could be very helpful in providing more resources, providing more interactions, providing online tutoring that will help students in under-resourced schools, high poverty schools. But I also fear, and this reflects some of the history of technology, we could end up with a situation because with the teacher shortages and other stresses in those schools, the kids in those schools spend a lot of time looking at a screen with an AI bot tutor, where the students in more privileged schools have highly qualified teachers they're interacting with, and they're using the technology for very creative project-based ways. So I think when we ask questions about equity, we really need to look at what is really happening at the ground level in the classroom, and what are the expectations of and for the teachers and of and for the students. It's a very, very complex situation, but my main mantra for today with all the folks here is go back to the big issues of education and ask, how can AI help us with these? Not what do we do about this thing called AI that has suddenly taken over so much of our lives?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think the way I think about it is this is a design challenge. We think I think we have a lot of open questions around what is the type of future we are designing for, which makes this moment very difficult. I think there are a lot of open questions around what are the types of skills students will still need to have in the age of AI. And so when you don't have a clear answer to those questions, it's very difficult to backwards plan. We're all educators. We know backwards planning. If you don't know the end goal, it's very difficult to backwards plan what a school looks like, what a learning experience looks like based on some unknown future. So another quick story for you, in some of the professional learning workshops we do, if anybody's seen the recent 60 Minutes profile on Conmigo, there's a profile of Conmigo. It's very in depth, and it basically profiles a school that has fully embraced Conmigo. So we show these clips to teachers. We show them a clip of this school that has fully embraced Conmigo as their AI platform, and we ask them, how do you feel about this vision of the future? Is this optimistic? Is this pessimistic? Is this utopia? Is this dystopia? And teachers and school leaders are all over the place. Some think it's the best and we should be exactly that's what we should be shooting for. Others think this is a really dystopian future where kids are locked to their screens. So I think I look at this as a design challenge, because we don't know what future we're designing for, and my hope is that we start to get some more clarity around that over the next few years.
Yeah. That's great, Chris. And Sophia, we'll let you get to your next questions in a minute, but we always have other things to say in response to each other. So if I can add one more, I think the other thing we have to grapple with as educators is AI is changing so quickly. There's been most of the attention has been on large language models like ChatGPT and Gemini, but now things have progressed so much in visual processing. And, I took a painting done by my mother and I asked ChatGPT to describe it and answer questions about it. And it could do that. I mean, it was able to process the artwork that I know it had never seen before. We're now getting more video and it can analyze videos. And the speech production has become much, much better, all of which can be great and can certainly serve students. But this has all happened, ChatGPT was released, 2 years and 3 months ago. And the trouble is the AI world is moving at an accelerating pace with billions and billions of dollars coming into it and people working on it all around. And education can't move like that. When we look at educational improvement we've got the students, we've got the teachers, we've got families, we've got administrators, we have standards, we have assessments, we have district boards, we have state boards, we have federal policies, whatever they may turn out to be in this day and age. And I think it's very important that as educators, we just take a deep breath and say, we really have to look at this carefully. We have to try some things. We have to engage our communities and our stakeholders. And we have to kind of keep calm and carry on, not just jump at every new advent in AI. Of course, there are some things we have to respond to immediately, the misuse of AI technologies for deep fakes or for blatant cheating and violating privacy. There are things that have to be dealt with, but I just worry that the paces of change between the AI world and the education world are so different. And I think educators have to defend what we need to do things carefully and properly and take the time to do that.
Glenn, you mentioned the misuse of AI technology. How can we really promote ethical and responsible use of AI AI in education for our students?
A very important question. I think, Chris has done some of this work, and our colleagues Victor Lee and others have also. And they remind us that, students always cheated, and as more cheating has gone on than we anticipated, AI technologies may make it easier, may make it more blatant. And I don't think there are simple technological solutions. The idea that there can be a detector that would tell a teacher whether an essay a student submitted was written by AI or not, that's never going to work. There's data showing that many of those are biased against students who aren't English language native speakers of English languages. And students have ways you put it through a second AI, you revise it. So I think it's really got to be going back to the acceptable use policies we already have, building on those for AI, and really engaging students in what's appropriate when and how we can encourage students to use AI in productive ways. And productive means that they're engaged, they're doing their own thinking, they're doing their own creating, they're collaborating with peers. And AI can help with that, or it can be damaging to that. And I don't think we can win unless we engage students in what's appropriate in this classroom, in this set of lessons. And I
Ben,
know
as an
Chris works on this. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Chris. You're on mute. Chris, you're on mute.
Ben, as an undergraduate student, what do you want to see in AI norms?
That's a good question. Let me take a second to reflect. I think we want to make sure students are familiar with what's possible with AI tools. Um, I think a lot of the education for students should be around how to engage with those tools, certainly limitations as well. I think people have to understand for AI that it's a different kind of intelligence than what it may seem or what it may initially seem like. So one way to think about AI is it is predicting each token next, which is like next word. It's kind of going word by word in a sense, and producing output rather than having this internal thinking engine where it's deductively thinking through things. And so that leads it to make like very simple mistakes sometimes that a human wouldn't make, despite it being really capable in other ways. Now, some of that's changing, and there's a lot that's being done, to equip AI with the ability to use a calculator, for instance, so that when it does give a math answer, it's actually backed by a real calculation that happened, as an example. But I think that underlying all of that, at the end of the day, AI systems are still inherently different than how many people think about artificial intelligence or just intelligence in general. And so I think that that's important to understand. And so that changes how we interact with AI. But I think that's key. And then generally, yeah, I think we want students to be able to understand the limitations, but also how to interact and engage well in a way that promotes their learning. And at the end of the day, students are going to be going into the workforce and using AI. I mean, however AI is integrated into education, it's going to be integrated most certainly into the workforce as it already has been, especially for a lot of cases. And so I think that starting out the learning of what AI can do, what it can't do, and how to engage well with AI earlier on in education, it's not just to promote the education itself and the value of learning, but also to promote how we should deal with these tools and these capabilities later on in life too for students. So I think it should promote them and help them during their learning process in school, but also give them a good foundation for going out into the world.
Yeah, so I think the original question was around responsible use, and I think it's amazing how many questions about AI are actually questions that are not about AI, but about pedagogy. The way I think about this is that, writing is my area of study. And so I often ask the question to teachers, why do students use AI to cheat at writing? And a lot of times it's because they're super overwhelmed and stressed and they feel, under a lot of pressure to do something correct. Sometimes they don't know that the behavior they're doing is cheating. And sometimes they just don't see the value of the assignment. And I think these are all reasons that students have always cheated. And that gets to the heart of what are we teaching and why are we teaching it? So classic example is the 5-paragraph essay. You gotta analyze this symbol in Great Gatsby. And it's not a very meaningful piece of writing for most students. And I think if you had asked me a year ago, I would have talked a little bit about, maybe how do we design smarter writing assignments that are more AI proof. But I actually have moved away from that a little bit. And now what I'm thinking more about is how do we design assessments, writing assessments that students are more motivated to do. So, if a student wants to cheat with AI, they're going to find a way, especially if the writing task you give them is not motivating to them, that it's not connected to their life in any way. But if you can reframe that assignment in ways that make it more meaningful, make it more engaging, more purposeful, then that student is more likely to actually see the value in the work and wanting to do it. So I've had teachers that have redesigned, Great Gatsby symbolism essays, and they're redesigning them in ways that connect the Great Gatsby and the American Dream to the Dream Act, and who gets to participate in the American Dream. They've done oral history type things. They've remixed the assignment with musical playlists where students have to choose musical lyrics and songs that relate to a theme. And I think what they've often found is that students are much more motivated to do that type of writing than they are if you just ask them to write an arbitrary 5-paragraph essay. And you'll notice I barely talked about AI in the last 2 minutes. So I think that's the kernel of it, is that a lot of these questions about AI are actually just questions about pedagogy. And my hope, my optimistic hope, is that because AI is sort of forcing these questions to the forefront, we can use this moment as an opportunity to redesign assessments.
Great, thanks. Moving on to our next question. What key questions should educators ask when assessing AI tools to ensure that they align with their students' needs and educational goals?
Well, I'll just use a variation of what I said before. They should start from their educational goals, not start, oh, there's tool A, B, C, D, and E, which one might we want to use? It's really, what are you looking for? Are you looking for making it easier for teachers to customize lesson plans for the diverse students in that classroom? Are you looking for a feedback tool like Klieger? And now there are many others that have been developed. Are you looking to help address students with special needs or with disabilities? Are you looking for a tool that will help you communicate with students' families? There are so many different things these tools can do. And I think it's very important for educators to start with, what are our priorities? What are the difficult things for us? What's taking too much of teachers' time? What's leading to teachers wanting to leave teaching, for example? Or what particular issues do we have? Do we have a large group of English language learning students and we don't have a teacher who speaks whatever native languages they come from? Can we use AI there? So that's the first step. And then it's the same as any other tool. This is our goal. How well does this tool help us meet that goal? And then there are some AI specific things. Does it meet our security and privacy requirements? Is it of reasonable value in what it costs? So I think there's a hierarchy, but always go back to, what is it we want this tool to help us with as the first question.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. It's backwards design. You start from first principles. The one thing I'll add to that is I think another key question is this tool doing something new, something of value that's new, or is it simply reproducing what I'm already doing? And that's the a problem that I have with a lot of new AI ed tech tools out there is they're simply reproducing what they're simply kind of just getting better at doing what's not always the right thing. It's making worksheets more efficiently, it's giving not great feedback more efficiently. And so I think that's a really big question is this adding some new value or is this just reproducing something that is not pedagogically sound?
Yeah, and I'll add, I think it's important to think through how does it impact the dynamic in the classroom, relationship between students and teachers primarily. For example, there are some very nice tools now that can listen to young children read aloud and can provide them with immediate feedback in the way a teacher or a teacher's aide would do. And, that's additional useful feedback. And it's great to catch errors quickly, or if the child's stuck, to give them a hint to move them forward. There's clearly value in that. But I worry that people will think, well, that will replace the teacher's aides that we fought so hard to get funding for in the classroom. And maybe I'm an old guy, but I think there's a very fundamental difference between a first, second, or second grade child getting feedback from a bot on the screen than from a human teacher who knows them, knows their background, knows their culture, knows what they're struggling with, can be, reinforcing and perhaps even inspiring. Um, and I just worry that we may overuse AI, even in some ways in which, if no adult is available and the child is reading aloud and getting some AI feedback, that's a plus too. But I think we really need to think, is this going to be interfering with teacher aide, student relationships? Is it going to be helping improve those?
I want to add on to how like AI, on top of being a tool that we can leverage, can also interfere with the classroom dynamics. We have a really good comment in the chat. It says that a lot of the conversations around AI in the classroom is linked to the fact that now we can't use assignment and assessment to some degree as a control mechanism. This is more adding on to like the disruptive, probably the less desirable side of the impact of AI. And I do wonder, with that regard, what's your thought on how that affects like both the pedagogy aspect as well as what's, how we should frame our thinking around AI use?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
all good question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
I think the most important thing is shifting away from product towards process. So I think whoever put that in the chat is probably mostly referring to summative assessment. So, I think long gone in writing, anyways, long gone are the days where you can say, here's a writing assignment, here's a 10-page essay, turn it in 2 weeks. That was never good pedagogy to begin with. So this is what I'm saying when I was saying like these are not AI questions, they're pedagogy questions. It becomes AI it makes it much more important that we see that we make students thinking visible at more stages of the learning process. And that has always been true, but it's more true now that we have AI. So instead of here's a 10-page essay, go home and turn it in 2 weeks, it should be, it should be like, hey, there should be more checkpoints along the way. And we should be doing formative assessments during the brainstorming phase, during the planning stage, during the outlining phase, during the drafting phase, during the revision phase. So I think, the key point here is we have to start moving away from, like one big summative assessment and more towards lots of formative checks where we're making students thinking visible at every stage of the process.
Yeah, agreed. And Chris took exactly what I was going to say, that we need to really think about a transition from it's not just the final product, it's the process. And that process can include AI tools. It could also include collaboration with other students. It can also include going and doing other kinds of research. The processes are changing. The processes in the workforce are changing to incorporate these tools. And I think we need to try to find ways to think more about helping students with the process, becoming self-driven learners, and the process of learning, rather than just checking off that final products and seeing what grade it might get. And that's a very, very big transition in education. But I think that's really we have to be heading because, you push a button and you have a product. It may only be a B minus, but it's an acceptable product according to the rubric being used to say, grade essays.
Yeah, we have some questions in the chat based on that. Steve says, can AI make that process-oriented approach more effective within sharp budget constraints?
The budget constraints are very hard to respond to because they're, again, at multiple levels. They're do you have the computers and the bandwidth? Do you have the AI tools? And, budgets have been changing, but it also needs to incorporate the budgets needed for the technical support staff, the budgets needed for the professional learning of the teachers to learn how to use these tools. And, education is short of funding, and there's no simple answer to that. Fortunately now, many of the students have their own devices. Many schools have one-to-one programs. Um, there are AI tools that will work even with some of the older devices, but the industry is going to try to drive schools to buy a lot of new devices for more powerful tools. So I think it can be done, but it's not simple. And again, that has to be a factor in your decision. It has to be within your budget, and there may be some great tools you can't use because they're simply not affordable.
Yeah, I agree. And if there's school leaders on the call, I would also argue like budget management is not really my lane, but I would argue that shifting teacher practice is maybe even a bigger challenge. So I think if there are school leaders in the webinar like that, that is a really important piece of the puzzle too, is helping teachers and staff make that shift in mindset away from, learning is a finished product to learning is a process where I see students thinking at every step of the way.
Yeah, I also want to highlight a message in the chat from Liza Long, um, emphasizing the importance of funding for teacher development and funding and time. As I said, I can be the historian here, and I can point to the history time and time again. Schools and districts spent a lot of money on a new technology. They might have introduced one-to-one devices, and they neglected to really understand these to be used well. These require significant changes, as Chris said, in pedagogy and in assessment. And teachers need time to experience using these tools as learners. They need time working with experts and colleagues around how this really changes processes in the classroom. And I unfortunately don't see a lot of that being built into state and district budgets to really provide the time that's needed for teachers to make use of these well. And we all tend to teach how we were taught, and we're looking at teachers to do things differently. They really need opportunities to use these tools and explore these tools.
Great, thank you for your responses. Before we get to the Q&A portion in about 4 minutes, I want to look to the future. As AI in education evolves, and it's evolving very rapidly, what safeguards should be in place to prevent it from exacerbating existing educational inequities or creating new forms of bias in educational outcomes?
Another critically important question. I'm looking at my colleagues looking to see if anybody has a good answer because it's such a difficult question. AI can perpetuate biases. It can produce hallucinations. And I think that's part of when we go back to AI literacy, teachers and students and parents and everybody involved need to understand the limitations of AI. And we actually have to help students as part of the process to become curators of what AI produces, to evaluate it, to see that it makes sense, and to see if it's biased or not. There's a lot of work going on trying to improve AI systems, but as some of the AI gurus at Stanford I've heard say that some of these things like hallucinations and bias are really built into the DNA of these systems because we can do reinforcement learning and try to fine tune them, but people don't even agree with what's accurate and what's not accurate and what's biased and what's not biased. And so there's no magical way AI will solve those problems. It will perpetuate what we collectively think and have said and have done. And some of that is great for students and some of that is not really what we want in the hands of students, but it's much more important that students understand they can't just take what the AI outputs and say, this is perfect. They need to do their own evaluation and curation of it.
My thought on this is it's everybody has a role. There's an all of the above answer. Certainly regulation is important. The developers of language models and these tools have a lot of responsibility, but individual teachers have a lot of responsibility too. And you as an individual teacher, you need to be scrutinizing what AI outputs and making sure you're not putting anything in front of your students that could be potentially harmful. So I think of this as sort of a Swiss cheese approach. Everybody has their layer that they're responsible for. There's going to be holes in every layer, but once you start stacking those layers on top of everybody, on top of one another, and everybody's doing their part, then you start to have a more robust guardrails. Yeah, so I think everybody has their role, and whatever your role is, that's kind of everybody has to pull their weight basically.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. And I would add, I don't think we have a clear answer yet of what the exact like safety built in or the exact regulation looks like. But I think that's good that we recognize that we don't know what that looks like yet, because I don't think we know exactly where things are going well enough and how the system will react and what that will look like to be crystal clear on what we should be doing yet. I think the most important part is that we work on our process and we make sure that teachers are empowered with the education and knowledge about what's happening, and particularly thinking about what do we value and thinking more about what are the goals for students. And so I think the most important part is that as we consider how we should adopt AI and move forward, we focus on the goals of students genuinely growing their own voices, and diversity of authentic voices as well, because AI is kind of has this just one AI that starts talks the same. So we want to make sure that we're encouraging that in students. We want to make sure we're genuinely making students better at writing, at other tasks, and it's not just their end product that's improving. We want to make sure that teachers are still in the fold and we have a human-centered approach. These are all values that are really important. I think as long as we keep talking about them and talk about them with people who are considering adopting these tools or building these tools, I think we'll get to a better place.
And thank you so much for all of the comments. And on the note of keep talking with people who are in the space, I want to open up the floor for people in our audience. Please feel free to raise your hand or just comment your question in the chat, and we can bring those questions to our lovely speakers.
I see there's lots of good discussion in the chat. I apologize, I'm not able to process that all in real time. But thank you for all the good comments.
I remember earlier, we have a question. Please go ahead.
Hi. So I'm a current high school student, and I definitely agree with your point on how teachers using AI detectors isn't really reliable, and I've seen my peers stressed because of that. Because even if they're writing their own essays or just simply using AI tools to generate similes, students are the line between cheating and just using AI to enhance learning is pretty ambiguous. So I think AI detector, there needs to be better ways, and we need to, as you mentioned, promote AI literacy rather than policing. And recently, I've been trying to gather a group of students to facilitate discourse among high school students. So my question is, what are good questions students can ask themselves to facilitate independent evaluation, curation, and understanding of AI tools?
I think Ben is the appropriate one to answer that since you're closer to that group. And I know you've written a paper for students, actually.
Yeah, I did link that. I think it goes back to a previous response I talked about, which is the very first thing we need to do is understand what do we truly value in the education system, and then what are the true goals of learning for students, for instance. And I think we sometimes optimize for the wrong things. We can optimize for, how good is the writing that the student is producing, and how high of marks does it get in terms of grading. But I think what's more important is that we're trying to teach students and improve their ability to think critically. We're trying to improve their ability to organize thoughts. So I'm just using writing as an example, trying to improve their ability to communicate well with others and their own confidence in their own writing and their own authentic voice. And these are true values. So I think the first step is understand what those values are. And the second step then is then when you evaluate these tools, don't evaluate it as a more shallow interpretation might be, okay, how well does this help me write a good essay? The question should be, how does this engagement with this tool change or promote, hopefully promote these values? And if it's not promoting these values or something is happening where it's replacing a process that is actually then in turn hindering some of these values, then that's a problem. So I would say identify the values, the underlying values and the underlying goals of education, and then you can evaluate the tools based upon those goals rather than something that might be a little more surface level, but more widely discussed, like just optimizing grades.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben and Ian. We also have Steve and then Michael. Please feel free to unmute whenever you're ready.
There we go. Yeah, the end of my question is going to be, do you know of any use cases? Here's the beginning. As several of you said, I remember Chris saying it particularly, you need to start with a good pedagogy and then ask the question, can this technology enable me to implement that pedagogy better or even to transform it somewhat because of its use? When I think about what research says are powerful pedagogies that we need to use somewhat more in higher education for sure, it's various forms of project-based education. So I'm going to put aside personal tutoring, which is another interesting lead, but I think project-based education, which can be labeled as a freshman project, a undergraduate research, service learning, capstone project. There are other labels, but what they have in common is the student should be working on a project that they care about. They're typically going to work on it in a group. And my question is, are there ways in which AI can help the participants in such a team learn what they need to know to do a project which may be qualitatively different from projects everybody else in the class is doing? Because it's divergent. Projects are divergent, the learning has to be divergent. So anyway, any indication yet that we're getting to a practical stage of tutoring in subjects that maybe only one student needs to learn about? Any progress in the AI helping the student realize what they don't know? They may come in thinking, well, I know what I need to know. Does the AI call and say, well, you don't know about this yet. Do you want help in learning about this? So any use cases, any research? I think it's a really important question to find out whether or not this can be robust enough and affordable enough to transform project-based education.
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. Thank you. And I'll say something. There's a group at Stanford led by John Mitchell, who's a computer science professor that's been looking at AI to support collaboration. Ben has been part of this group also. And it's really interesting because they have different students, and these are all at the research level. It's not like there's a product I can point you to. But the question of, can AI be one of the collaborative group and help move the forward? But there's another question is, can AI be a collaboration coach, kind of Jiminy Cricket for each student, saying, you're dominating or you're not contributing? Can it be a facilitator of the group and ask questions? And it really opened my eyes to think about AI differently, is what are the roles can it play to further the work of a collaborative group? And of course, they're all working on different kinds of projects. So, and now as we're moving more to agent AIs that can access information itself and put together a sequence of activities, I think we're getting closer and closer to that. And Ben, you've dug into this also, I know. Other thoughts?
Yeah, oh, definitely, and that's good background on it. Oh, and it's actually one of the projects we've worked on is even more related to what you're describing. And the goal is building out a system where you have a multi-agent team. So imagine multiple AI agents working together to develop software, for instance. And so you have one of the agents is a product manager, another is a software engineer, and there's a designer. But the interesting twist is that the system actually allows humans to take on any of those roles as well. So you could imagine this being great for pedagogy, where let's say you have someone wants to learn how to code within a team, and you have an AI product manager, an AI software engineer, an AI designer, and then they are the second software engineer. And so they get mentored by the AI software engineer that's there, and they get the experience of working within that scaffolded team. And so that's a really good example. When the framework that we're working on is agnostic as well to the domain. So I use software engineering as an example, but it can be anything. I've tested it out and used it for deductive logic, for instance. We're interested in even looking at like the medical field and thinking about applications there with pedagogy. And so I think the issue is that we're not yet at a place with model capabilities where this is going to be like mainstream. And we're still these agents and building real agents that have autonomy that function like humans might in a team. We still have work to do there. I think the field still has to advance models to be more and more capable to do that. But I'm hoping that the work that we're working on, I'm sure others are working on this vein too, it will help to build out those systems so that when we get there, we can have these really strong pedagogical experiences for students that are really based around not just projects, but also a project environment, working within that simulated team. And our goal too is to start with user testing this year. And so I'll let you know the results of that if you're interested in reaching out, and we'll hopefully have more with the system and such, and that'll be open source and available for teachers, educators, and developers.
One, yes, I'd be very interested in following what you're doing. It just opened a whole new vista for me. The other sort of a generic cautionary note. I've been around long enough, going back to the Apple II, to have seen a phenomenon occur repeatedly, which is that a new technology comes along, bright people and grant makers get really interested in that. They do great demos and tests and so on, and first encouraging evaluations come. But the next wave of technology is not just an expansion, or isn't an expansion of the previous one. It's over in a different place entirely, and the smart people and the adventurous faculty move over there. And it's one of the reasons why the course of adoption of educational technology has been marked by tragedy after tragedy of people putting a lot of love and work and money into something, and then it just gets left behind because of the phenomenon that I think it may have been Glenn mentioned, which is education has to change, can only change slowly. And technology is not only jumping forward, it's jittering around. So think about that. What do you want to leave in your wake? And can you do anything to make sure that the next wave and the next wave keep deepening the furrow that you're starting to dig? And it sounds like a great furrow. Congratulations.
Thank you. And that's helpful advice. I think one of the things that we're hoping to do too is starting more broadly, and there's a term called abstracting, which is a development term, but basically it means thinking about the tools that you're building from a more generic lens. And so that's one of the reasons why it's agnostic to any domain. And so I think the goal is that if we were building something more narrow and then things shift, I think there's a higher risk of that moving out of the domain of relevance. But at the same time, I think that what you described is kind of an inevitable risk to new technology. So I'll be thinking about that more, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I'll just thank Michael for your postings. I suspect we're out of time. Is that correct? Or can we have time for Michael's question?
We can have time for Michael's question, and maybe
Good.
as you answer, you can sleep in some recommendations for what people to follow, or books or podcasts that you think you would recommend in the line of general spirit of pedagogy versus AI user integration, etc. Please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Yeah, thank you all for this. Clara sounds amazing. I'm excited to look at it a little bit more deeper. Mine is like a technical nerdy question that I had asked earlier. I know Ben replied to it. I'm curious about like what foundation model the program uses to generate its outputs, and how is that like fine-tuned? Yeah, I'll leave it there. Hopefully a quick answer.
Yeah, I'll do a quick answer, then shift it to Glenn. And by the way, anyone who's interested in Clara, please feel free fill out this contact form I just put into the chat, and that should get you contacted for when it's offline temporarily, so we're integrating it into the new platform, which will have a lot more functionality. And once that's done, I think we'll be able to reach out to you all. So quickly, it was using OpenAI's GPT-4, and we may advance it to newer models. We are less focused on fine tuning. One of the things that we're focused on and seeing is how far we can get with prompting. And one of the reasons for that is because we want it to do really good questions. But we also want to be able to have quick experimentation and iteration. So we haven't done fine tuning on the original version because our focus was on the question part, which wasn't that difficult actually for an LLM to generate the good questions as long as it had the right instruction. But I think in the future, we're going to find fine tuning is more important. And I think the most important part of that process is going to be the data. So focusing less on the fine tuning process for the model, but getting really solid data where you have solid examples of strong pedagogy that you can train an AI on.
Thank you for the great response. I hope that answers your question, Michael. And on the concluding note, is there anything that you would recommend for our audience to follow, or maybe to check out, like any newsletter or podcast to check out?
There are so many. I put a couple in the chat. Ethan Malick's blog I always find insightful. Amanda Bickerstaff at AI for Education is producing a lot of good materials for educators. But the list goes on and on. I don't know, what do you use these days, Chris, to recommend?
I feel like we have a list of resources somewhere that we wrote up at one point, but
We do. It feels a little out of date. That's the trouble. Every time you do something, you turn around and it's out of date. But we can post that.
I listen to the AI Daily Brief on Spotify. That's where I just get my AI news every day. And then mostly, I mean, the most valuable insights I get is just from being able to talk to school leaders and educators on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, and I see we should be recommending the AIX blog. Some of the participants are, and I'm sure other participants have other great recommendations. So we'll share. We'll look back at the list we put together and maybe update it a little bit and share that. The
I
future.
definitely second.
Yeah.
So I
Okay.
definitely second all of those recommendations.
We can definitely compile a list of the recommendations from the chat, as well as anything that you want to share later into our follow-up email, so that all of our attendees can get a list of recommended things to follow.
That would be great. Thank you.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Glenn, Chris, and Ben, for sharing such valuable insights on AI literacy and equity and AI integration. And thank you all of you for joining us and for your thoughtful questions in the chat. We are open to any feedback, so if you have questions or feedback for us, we're going to be putting up a QR code on the screen, and then we'll also be sending a link in the chat to do so. And thanks again for your time today, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.